misreading.
He was worth $4 billion. He had a name on hospital wings, a private jet, and a smile that made people feel like everything in the world was going to be okay. When he walked into a room, people stood a little straighter. When he spoke, people listened. For 30 years, the city of Denver, Colorado worshipped a man named Richard Harlow. 30 years. And not once did anyone think to look behind the curtain. But here's the thing about secrets. They don't stay buried forever. No matter how deep you push them, no matter how many lawyers you hire, no matter how many checks you write, the truth has a way of finding the light. And when it finally does, it doesn't just walk out quietly. It comes out like a fire, and it burns everything. Every single thing. This is the story of Richard Harlow, the man who built an empire on a lie, and the one person, the last person anyone would have ever expected, who finally burned it all down. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about someone you loved turned out to be a carefully constructed illusion? What if the person you trusted more than anyone in this world had been lying to you since the day you first shook his hand? And what if the worst part wasn't the lie itself, but who got hurt because of it? Here is what people knew about Richard Harlow. He grew up poor in a small Ohio town called Millbrook. He built his first company in a garage at 22 years old. By 35, he was worth $500 million. By 50, his construction and real estate empire covered 6 states. He was a philanthropist, a church elder, a man who paid for over 200 college scholarships out of his own pocket. He was married to the same woman, Sandra, for 31 years. He had 2 daughters, Claire and Melissa. He coached youth baseball every summer. He was exactly the kind of man this country wants to believe still exists. But there was something underneath all of it. Something that started with a single phone call to a small accounting firm in 1993. Something that 2 people spent their entire careers trying to keep quiet. And something that, in the winter of 2023, a 61-year-old hospice nurse named Donna Hartley could no longer live with keeping to herself. What was the secret? What did Donna know? And why did it take 30 years for the truth to finally surface? Stay with us, because this story is going to change the way you think about power, loyalty, and what it really costs to look the other way. To understand how Richard Harlow got away with it for so long, you have to understand where he came from. And more than that, you have to understand the world he built around himself, because that world was not built by accident. Richard was born in 1958 in Millbrook, Ohio. His father, Gene Harlow, was a factory worker. His mother, Patrice, cleaned houses for the wealthier families on the north side of town. They weren't poor in the way that makes headlines. They were poor in the way that's invisible. The kind of poor where your shoes are always just a little too small, and you learn early not to ask for things because you already know the answer. Richard's older brother, Tommy, got into trouble young. Drugs, then jail, then more drugs. His younger sister, Karen, dropped out of high school at 16 to help their mother after Gene's health declined. Richard watched all of this, and he made himself a promise that he would get out. Not just for himself, but to prove something. To prove that where you come from doesn't have to be where you end up. He was sharp in school. Not the most popular kid, not the star athlete, but relentlessly focused. He worked at a hardware store after school, saved every dollar, and at 18, he earned a partial scholarship to Ohio State. He studied civil engineering. He was the first person in his entire family to step foot on a college campus. By 22, he had moved to Denver with a truck, $3,000 in savings, and an idea for a small construction company focused on affordable housing. He called it Harlow Builds. His first client was a small church in Aurora that needed an addition. He did the work himself, nights and weekends, and when it was done, the pastor gave him a handshake and told him, "Young man, God brought you here for a reason." Richard never forgot those words. He put them on a plaque in his first real office. It stayed on his wall for the next 30 years. By his late 20s, Harlow Builds was no longer small. Denver was booming. The housing market was hungry. Richard had a gift not just for building, but for reading people, for knowing exactly what a client or a city council member or a bank executive needed to hear. He was warm without being fake, ambitious without being cold. People trusted him immediately. and that trust was the foundation of everything he built. In 1989, he married Sandra Ames, a schoolteacher from Colorado Springs who had no interest whatsoever in wealth or status, and that, Richard always said, was exactly why he fell in love with her. Their wedding was small. Her dress cost $200 from a consignment shop. They honeymooned in a cabin in the Rockies. Sandra used to laugh and say they couldn't even afford a real honeymoon back then. By the early 90s, they had 2 daughters. Claire, born in 1991. Melissa, born in 1993. By 1995, the Harlow family lived in a stone house in Cherry Creek. Richard's company had 30 employees, and everything looked like the story was writing itself exactly the way it was supposed to. This was the American dream, walking around in a button-down shirt and work boots. This was what people wanted to believe in. But 1993 was also the year something else happened. Something that nobody outside of a very small circle would know about for the next 3 decades. Something that the public, Richard Harlow, the man on the charity galas and the magazine covers, had buried so deep inside the story of his own success that it had almost become invisible even to him. Almost. Her name was Carol Raines. And in the spring of 1993, she was 26 years old, a junior accountant at a small firm called Westgate Financial in downtown Denver. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, a cat named Oliver, and she was exactly the kind of quiet, methodical person who notices things that other people miss. She had taken the job at Westgate because the pay was decent, and she had $40,000 in student loan debt and a mother in assisted living in Phoenix who needed help with her bills every month. Carol wasn't looking for trouble. She was just doing her job. And doing her job, in the spring of 1993, meant going through the books of one of Westgate's most important clients, a rapidly growing construction company called Harlow Builds. What Carol found in those books didn't jump out immediately. It never does, with fraud this careful. It was a pattern. Small disbursements to a company called RG Holdings that didn't appear in any public records. Invoices for services with no corresponding work orders. A shadow stream of cash, moving quietly through accounts, that totaled, over the course of about 14 months, just under $2 million. In 1993 money, $2 million siphoned from a company that was, on paper, doing everything right. Carol brought it to her supervisor, a man named Gerald Finch. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. Gerald Finch did not call the authorities. Gerald Finch did not file a report. Gerald Finch called Richard Harlow directly. And 2 days later, Gerald Finch had a brand new car in his driveway and a wire transfer into a private account that would keep him comfortable for the next 15 years. Carol was told that the discrepancies had been reviewed and explained. She was told to close the file. And when she pushed back, when she said she wasn't comfortable with that, she received a letter 3 weeks later informing her that her position at Westgate Financial had been eliminated due to restructuring. She was 26 years old, in debt, and responsible for her mother's care. She took the severance package. She found another job, and she told herself that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe there was an explanation she just didn't have the clearance to see. She spent the next 20 years trying to believe that. But here is what Carol did not know, and what makes this story so much darker than a simple case of fraud. The money in RG Holdings was not going to Richard's personal accounts. It wasn't for a vacation house or a sports car or any of the things you might assume a man of his ambition would want. The money was going to a woman in Colorado Springs named Margaret Tillman. And Margaret Tillman had a son, a boy born in September of 1992, a boy named Daniel, a boy who was Richard Harlow's son, a son that Richard Harlow had chosen to erase from his life before his wife ever found out he existed. Take a moment and think about that. A child, a real, living, breathing human being, hidden away like an accounting error, paid for quietly, kept out of sight, while Richard Harlow went home every evening to his wife Sandra, kissed his daughters goodnight, bowed his head in church on Sundays, and collected awards for being a pillar of the community. How does a man do that? How does a person live on both sides of that wall and not break? And what does it cost the person on the other side? The child who grows up knowing his father exists, knowing he is out there, and knowing that he has chosen not to know him. Those are the questions that nobody was asking in the 1990s, because nobody knew to ask them. And Richard Harlow, for 30 years, was going to make sure it stayed that way. The payments to Margaret Tillman continued. routed through a series of shell accounts that became more sophisticated as Richard's wealth and resources grew. Margaret, to her credit, never went to the press. She had signed a legal agreement in 1993, one that Richard's lawyers made very clear was serious. She raised Daniel alone, on her nurse's salary and the monthly deposits that arrived without fail in her account. She told Daniel his father was a businessman who lived out of state, that the situation was complicated, that someday he would understand. Daniel grew up smart, quiet, and carrying a weight he couldn't quite name. He graduated high school, got a nursing degree, and by 2018, he was working at a hospice facility in Denver, not 10 miles from the Cherry Creek neighborhood where his father lived in a stone house with his wife and 2 daughters. If you're watching this right now, I want to ask you something honest. What would you do in Daniel's position? If you found out the truth, that your father was not just absent but wealthy, famous, and celebrated right there in your own city, what would you feel? Because what Daniel felt when his mother finally told him the full truth on his 25th birthday was not anger. It was something quieter and harder than anger. It was grief. The grief of a life that could have been different. And the grief, if you've ever felt it, is the emotion that doesn't go away. If you're still with us, drop a comment and tell us what you think of Richard Harlow so far. Because we are just getting started. For 3 years after learning the truth, Daniel Tillman did nothing with it. He went to work, cared for his patients at the hospice facility, and tried to figure out what kind of person he wanted to be. He had his mother's phone number for a lawyer, but he never called. He had a name, a face he recognized from Denver news coverage, charity event photos, business magazines. He had everything he needed to go public. And he chose not to. Because Daniel Tillman, in a kind of quiet dignity that is honestly remarkable given what had been done to him, didn't want to destroy anyone. He just wanted to be seen. He thought about writing a letter. He wrote several drafts. He threw them all away. He thought about showing up at one of the charity events. He drove to the venue once, sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, and drove home. He talked to a therapist for almost 2 years. And slowly, over time, he began to accept that the man who was his father biologically had made a choice. And that choice said far more about Richard Harlow than it ever would about Daniel. He had made peace with it, or something close to peace. And he might have stayed there, in that quiet, dignified silence, for the rest of his life. Except for what happened in the fall of 2022. Carol Raines was 65 years old and had been working at a Denver credit union for the last 2 decades when she saw Richard Harlow's face on the cover of Colorado Business magazine. He was being named Philanthropist of the Year. The headline read, "The man who gives everything back." Carol stared at that magazine for a long time. She thought about the file she had closed 30 years ago because she was afraid. She thought about the car in Gerald Finch's driveway. She thought about all the years she had spent quietly reassuring herself that she'd probably been wrong, that there must have been an explanation. And something in her, after 30 years of silence, just stopped believing that lie. She hired an investigator. Not to go to the press, she wasn't there yet. Just to understand, to confirm what she had seen. And the investigator, a methodical former IRS agent named Philip Greer, came back to her 6 weeks later with a report that was significantly worse than anything Carol had imagined. The original fraud from 1993 had never really stopped. It had evolved, changed its shape, moved through different entities. Over 3 decades, the total amount redirected through various channels, away from company accounts, away from investors, away from employees' pension contributions, was estimated conservatively at over $38 million. And the trail, if you knew where to look, led directly back to Richard Harlow. Carol's hands shook when she read that number. She was not a dramatic person. She did not, by her own description, have a single dramatic bone in her body. But she sat in her kitchen that evening and cried for about 20 minutes. Not for herself. For the employees who had contributed to a pension fund that turned out to have been quietly hollowed out. For the investors who had trusted this man with their life savings. For the city of Denver, which had watched this man accept award after award and believed every single second of it. And then she thought about one more thing. She thought, somewhere out there, someone else knows. Someone closer to this than me. Someone who has been living with this for 30 years and deserves to have it over. She didn't know about Daniel yet, but Philip Greer did. And he put Carol Raines and Daniel Tillman in contact with each other on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2022. They met at a coffee shop in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, The same neighborhood where Carol had once lived in her one-bedroom apartment with her cat Oliver, back when she was 26, and still believed that doing the right thing was simple. They sat across from each other for 3 hours, and by the time they left, they had made a decision together. The truth was coming out. Now here is where I want to ask you something, because I think about this moment a lot. These two people, a 65-year-old accountant and a 30-year-old hospice nurse, who had both been hurt by the same man in completely different ways, sitting in a coffee shop in Denver and deciding that 30 years was long enough. What kind of courage does that take? What would you have done if you were Carol? If you had spent 30 years second-guessing a decision you made because you were scared and you finally had a chance to make it right, would you take it? And what about Daniel? What do you say to a stranger who tells you she is proof of what was done to you? Proof that has been sitting in filing cabinets for 30 years. I think most of us would like to believe we'd be brave. But bravery looks different when it's real, and the stakes are real, and the name on the door of that stone house in Cherry Creek is someone the whole city believes in. Carol Raines and Daniel Tillman retained separate attorneys and presented their evidence independently to the Colorado Attorney General's office in January of 2023. The investigation that followed was quiet, methodical, and took 11 months. During that time, Richard Harlow continued to attend charity events. He was photographed at a scholarship dinner in March. He gave an interview to a Denver magazine in June about legacy and giving back. He coached youth baseball that summer, just as he had for the past 15 years. And inside his world, at least on the surface, nothing seemed wrong. Sandra planned a trip to Italy for their anniversary. Claire called from New York, where she was working as a pediatric resident. Melissa was pregnant with their first grandchild. The family was fine. The world was fine. The plaque on the office wall still said, "God brought you here for a reason." And Richard Harlow, at 65 years old, had almost convinced himself completely that everything he had built was real. Almost. Because here is the moment that no one in Denver saw coming. The moment that even Carol Raines and Daniel Tillman did not plan for. The moment that changed the entire story. It was a hospice patient. A 78-year-old man named Frank Whitfield who had been admitted to Daniel's facility in August of 2023. Frank had been an attorney in Denver for 40 years. Semi-retired. A man of careful words and long silences. And on a Thursday evening in September, 3 weeks before he died, Frank called Daniel into his room and said he needed to tell him something. He said he had been carrying it too long, and he couldn't go without putting it down. Frank Whitfield, it turned out, had been one of the attorneys who drafted the original legal agreement between Richard Harlow and Margaret Tillman in 1993. He had known about Daniel his entire life. He had known about the fraud. He had known about Gerald Finch's payoff. And because he had been paid extremely well for his silence, and because he was a man who had spent his career telling himself that every client deserved a vigorous defense, he had kept it all locked away in 30 years of professional distance. But now, with the end of his life in sight, Frank Whitfield handed Daniel Tillman a manila envelope containing documents, originals, not copies, that filled in the last pieces of the story that Carol's investigator had been unable to locate. Daniel sat in his car in the parking lot of the facility for an hour after Frank gave him that envelope. He didn't open it right away. He held it on his lap and thought about his mother. He thought about her working double shifts when he was in elementary school. He thought about all the times she had said, "Someday you'll understand," and how he had never quite believed her when she said it without sadness. He thought about what Frank Whitfield had just done, an old man, dying, choosing to spend his last weeks in discomfort so that someone else could have the truth. And Daniel thought, this is what it looks like when someone finally decides they don't want to be a part of the lie anymore. He opened the envelope, and he called Carol. Now I want you to stop for a moment right here. Because what Frank Whitfield did, that quiet, private act of finally telling the truth when there was nothing left to gain and nothing left to lose, I think that is one of the most human things in this entire story. What does it say about us, as people, that it sometimes takes reaching the end of our lives to finally say what we should have said 30 years ago? And what does it cost the people who wait on the other end of that truth? What would you have felt if you were Daniel, sitting in that parking lot, holding that envelope? In December of 2023, the Colorado Attorney General's office announced charges against Richard Harlow on 15 counts, including securities fraud, pension fund misappropriation, and obstruction of justice. The total financial damage to investors, employees, and pension holders was confirmed at $41 million. The press conference lasted 45 minutes. Richard Harlow's attorney read a brief statement on his behalf. Richard himself said nothing publicly that day. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. By noon, it was national. By evening, the photograph that accompanied every article was the same one. Richard shaking the governor's hand at a charity gala 2 years earlier, both of them smiling. Denver was stunned. Not angry yet. Just stunned. The kind of stun that happens when something you believed in without question turns out to have been hollow the whole time. Sandra Harlow found out about Daniel the same morning the charges were filed. She had not known. That much became clear very quickly to everyone around her. She had spent 31 years married to a man who had told her everything, or so she had believed. She had built her entire life around a version of Richard Harlow that turned out to have a room inside it she had never been allowed to enter. She moved out of the Cherry Creek house within 2 weeks. Claire and Melissa, to their enormous credit, did not abandon their mother. They stood with her, publicly and quietly, in a way that was genuinely moving to watch. Richard Harlow pleaded guilty to 8 of the 15 counts in a plea agreement reached in the spring of 2024. He received a sentence of 9 years. He was 66 years old on the day he was sentenced. He stood in the courtroom in a gray suit and looked considerably smaller than he had in every photograph taken of him over the previous 3 decades. Before the judge imposed the sentence, he was given an opportunity to speak. He said that he was sorry. He said it to the investors, to his family, to the city. And then he paused, and he looked in the direction of Daniel Tillman, who was seated in the gallery, and he said, "I'm sorry to you most of all. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to be your father." Daniel Tillman did not respond in the courtroom. He nodded once, very slightly, and that was all. Later, in an interview that Daniel gave to a Denver journalist, not a major network, just a local journalist who had covered the story with real care and real respect, he said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, "I didn't want to destroy him. I never wanted that. I wanted him to be accountable. Those are 2 very different things. And I think people confuse them a lot." Donna Hartley, you remember her name from the very beginning of this story, was Carol's neighbor in Capitol Hill. It was Donna who first encouraged Carol, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in early 2022, to stop second-guessing what she had seen in those books 30 years ago. It was Donna who said, simply, "If you know something, Carol, you don't have to carry it alone." Donna was not a lawyer or an investigator or a journalist. She was a hospice nurse who had spent her career watching people reach the end of their lives and realize what they had left unsaid. She had seen it enough times to recognize the weight of it. And she saw that weight on Carol. And she said something simple and true. And that, one neighbor, one Sunday, one quiet sentence, is what set everything else in motion. Carol Raines is retired now. She lives in Denver. She has said in multiple interviews that she wishes she had been braver at 26. And then she says, and this part matters, that she was 26 years old, in debt, caring for her mother, and afraid. And she thinks we should be careful about judging people for the choices they make when they are vulnerable and afraid. She is right about that. She is very, very right about that. Daniel Tillman still works in hospice care. He did not pursue a civil case against his father. He has said that the money was never the point. He has a life he built himself. He says he is at peace. Whether that peace is fully real or still partly being constructed, only Daniel knows. But he says it, and he keeps going to work. And he sits with people at the end of their lives, and he holds their hands, and he listens to the things they wish they had said sooner. And I think, if you understand what that means after everything he has been through, you understand something very important about who Daniel Tillman is. Richard Harlow is currently serving his sentence. The Cherry Creek house was sold. The scholarship fund bearing his name was renamed. The hospital wing has not yet decided what to do with the letters on the wall. The plaque that said, "God brought you here for a reason," was not in the courtroom. Nobody knows where it is now. And now I want to ask you, sincerely, what you think about this story. Not just what you think about Richard Harlow, though I'd love to hear that too, but what you think about the people around him. Think about Carol, who was 26 and scared and made a decision she spent 30 years regretting. Can you honestly say you would have done differently? Think about Frank Whitfield, who carried the truth for 30 years and only put it down when he had nothing left to lose. How many of us are carrying something right now that we keep telling ourselves we'll deal with later? And think about Daniel. A man who was denied a father, denied a name, denied 30 years of what he was owed, and who still stood in that courtroom and chose accountability over destruction. What does that tell you about character? What does it tell you about what we're really made of when the moment finally comes? I believe there is something in this story for every single one of us. Because most of us will never be a billionaire. Most of us will never be the person at the center of a scandal like this. But all of us, at some point, face a version of that choice. The choice between the easy silence and the harder truth. Between protecting ourselves and doing what is right. And the thing about those choices is that you rarely get to make them when you're comfortable and safe and have nothing to lose. You usually have to make them when you're scared, or tired, or in debt, or just trying to get through the week. That is when it counts. That is when it defines you. So here's what I want to know from you. Leave your answer in the comments. If you were Carol in 1993, would you have pushed harder? If you were Daniel, at 25, learning the full truth, what would your first move have been? And if you were one of the employees whose pension was taken from them, the people who worked honestly for decades and were quietly robbed, what would justice look like to you? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life and the choices you've made or are still making, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this story. That means something to us. It really does. And if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories, because we have some that are going to stop you completely in your tracks. We'll see you in the next one.